Welcome to the Labour Women's Declaration webinar, Speaking Up for Women's Rights in the Labour Party. I am going to be the facilitator this evening, and I'm Paula Bolton. The Labour Women's Declaration Working Group is a non-hierarchical feminist collective of currently 15 women from across the UK and all sections of the Labour Party who vigorously discuss and debate before we ever reach a decision. If consensus is new to you, welcome to a fun time. The only thing that we ever agree on, or that we know we agree on, are the 7 points of our declaration. We aim to amplify the voices of all Labour Party members who have been intimidated or bullied for speaking out about sex and gender, and also to encourage others to join us in this vital conversation, knowing that they will have a big support network behind them. So let's meet the women behind the Labour Women's Declaration.
Hello, I'm Alice Bondi. I'm in the Penrith and Border CLP, and I'm a branch chair, and I'm one of the contacts for the Northern region.
Hi, I'm Bronwyn Davis. I'm from Cardiff North CLP. I'm a delegate to our local campaign forum, and I'm one of the regional coordinators, well, country coordinators, I should say, for Wales.
Hi, I'm Carol Lang-Harrod. I'm from Mid Derbyshire CLP, and I'm one of the regional organisers for the East Midlands.
Hello, I'm Kerry Williams. I'm from Tottenham CLP. I'm a branch chair, and I'm one of the London regional contacts.
Hello, I'm Diane Holyoake. I'm from the North Somerset CLP, and I am one of Labour Women's Declaration's regional coordinators for the South West.
I'm Helen McCoates. I'm Salford and Eccles CLP. I'm a branch chair there, and I'm one of the North West coordinators.
We can't hear Helen, don't know why, but Helen Rogers is trying to tell us about herself. Okay, we'll come back to Helen.
I'll come in next then.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jane Ayres. I'm from High Peak CLP, which is in the East Midlands, but I'm actually helping coordinate the Northwest region with Helena over there. And I've been a member since about 1983. Usually as an active branch member, but I was a women's officer once, and that'll do. Thank you very
much. Okay, Lynn.
Hello. Hi, I'm Lynn Alderson. I'm from Totnes, South Hams CLP down in Devon. I'm chair of CLP, and I'm one of the Southwest region coordinators too.
I'm Shireen Benjamin. I'm in Edinburgh Eastern CLP, and I'm the Scotland coordinator for LWD.
I'm Sue Lent. I'm from Cardiff Central CLP. I'm a county councillor and also one of the coordinators for Wales.
Hi, I'm Tracy Smith. I don't think you can see me, but I'm from Sheffield Central CLP. Yeah, that's me.
Okay, and I'm sorry that we've lost Helen. I just asked her. Anyway, never mind. She'll speak to us later. She's a recent member of our group of 15. I'm from Corby and East Northampton CLP, and until 2 weeks ago, I was a prospective unitary authority candidate, but I withdrew because of this issue. I have 2 roles within the Labour Women's Declaration network, and one is that I organise a group for any lesbians that are in the Labour Party, and if any of you are attending tonight and don't know about us, please do get in touch and follow @Lesbian Labour on Twitter. You'll find out what we're up to. And also I set up a cross-party forum called Women Uniting, and that links all of the women's pledge groups from all the political parties. Now we're going to start. That's all the Labour Women's Declaration members who will take your questions later on. But to let you know about the order of programme tonight, we've got 2 speakers, and in between the speakers we'll talk a little bit about the progress that Labour Women's Declaration have made during the year, and also look at our future priorities. We've chosen a very simple webinar format tonight to allow as much interaction as possible. We sold out with 550 of you attending, so we don't actually know how many there are. There will only be the panelists on screen, but to allow as much interaction as possible, we're leaving the chat and the Q&A box open. In terms of general housekeeping, if you would like to put your questions in the Q&A box, we ask you, if you wouldn't mind, to give us your full name and tell us where you're from. It helps us know who we've got here. If there's questions you like and that you want to be chosen, please upvote them. And anything that isn't chosen tonight, we promise, this is our promise, we're going to answer in due course on our website. As I've said, the chat will be open for comments, and robust debate is not only the lifeblood of democracy, but we encourage it. Just keep it comradely and respectful, please. And if there is anything that you're concerned about, please direct a chat message to our webinar host or the panelists. Okay, now the aims. We've got a mixed audience tonight, or well, we think we have from looking at the the list of who had signed up on the Eventbrite. Many of you we know are already active, but an equal number are new to us and maybe to the issues. So let's hope we can all learn something, meet someone and be inspired. We also want to offer support to anyone who is isolated, or any of you suffering abuse or harassment as a result of your activism, and to let you know that you are not alone. We exist, the Labour Women's Declaration, within a wider circle of other Labour women, and all of us are part of a growing web of interconnected, self-organised groups and individuals. Remember, it goes one at a time. Collectively, we need to carry on challenging the threat to women and girls posed by gender ideology. So without more ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Alice Bondi lives in a remote spot in the North Pennines. Despite having retired, she's working harder than ever, much of it LWD work, when she isn't growing vegetables or entertaining the 3 cats with whom she shares her space. How 50 years of women's liberation led to the Labour Women's Declaration. Thank you, Alice.
To explain how the declaration itself is a natural outcome of what women have been saying and doing for the last 50 years, I'm going to outline just a little of what I and others have been up to over that time and why I came to be involved with the Labour Women's Declaration Working Group. I'm 71 now, and back in the very early 1970s, I was involved with both the early women's liberation movement and the Gay Liberation Front. This was an era when women could be refused service in a pub, when you could be sacked if it was discovered that you were gay or lesbian, when women who didn't conform to the traditional expectations of women to wear makeup and dresses, to get married and stay at home with children, were regarded with considerable suspicion, and being openly gay or lesbian resulted in contempt and even violence. The groups I was involved with and the work we did contributed to changes in attitudes and changes to law and practice. The domestic abuse refuges and rape crisis centres we set up entirely through very hard voluntary work and a lot of begging for the use of short-term properties and for minimal funding and so on, were the first time that the issues of sexual and other abuse were discussed publicly and acknowledged as important. The importance of single-sex spaces for traumatised women became increasingly obvious. Police still refused to intervene when called to a house where obvious, visible physical abuse was taking place. This was regarded as not criminal, but just a domestic, until the 1974-9 Labour governments introduced protections for abused women. All women's shortlists and women's officers in every CLP demonstrated Labour's commitment to promoting women's rights and countering the disadvantages faced by girls and women as a result of the socialisation we experience from birth onwards. The introduction of the 2010 Equality Act by the last Labour government was a milestone, offering protection to 9 characteristics: age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex, and sexual orientation. It recognises that there may be conflicts between different protected characteristics. When changes were proposed to the Gender Recognition Act of 2004 to permit self-declaration as the other gender, often in tandem with discussion about changes to the Equality Act, many feminists felt alarmed. It appeared that what we thought had been established and understood generally, and particularly within Labour, was now seen as irrelevant. Our concern was amplified when it was decreed without discussion at conference and with no consultation with women's groups that anyone who identified as a woman was eligible for both all women shortlists and the post of women's officer. No change had happened in the law, and as we now know, no change is planned by this current government for England and Wales, though things may take a different turn in Scotland. In common with many institutions and businesses, Labour chose to run ahead of the law, assuming that self-identification with no gatekeeping of any sort was set to become the law within a short time. There are very many ramifications to such a change, which really demand full investigation and equality impact assessments for all the protected characteristics of the Equality Act. And yet, without actual law change, and without consultation with all affected, changes have been happening. Those refuges, rape crisis centres, homeless women's hostels, and so on that we worked so hard for, now find that they will be refused funding unless they agree to include anyone who self-identifies as a woman. Where once women's prisons housed only women and almost all hospital wards were sex segregated, where it was possible for a woman to request a female clinician to undertake intimate examination and such procedures as cervical smear tests, now it is largely impossible to insist that by woman one means the straightforward biological definition as always used to be understood. It is that biology which results in the lived experience of a female body, as well as the specific expectations and pressures which result in female socialization. This is the context into which the consultation on changes to the Gender Recognition Act appeared, and which led to women in all political parties and none becoming concerned about their party's policies and intentions. The SNP women were the first to create a public declaration, the Women's Pledges, and a group of Labour women arranged a get-together for gender-critical Labour members just before the Filia conference in Bradford in October 2019, where we decided that Labour needed a similar declaration to make visible the very many of us who were deeply uncomfortable with the way things were moving. We were particularly concerned because many of us had seen Labour as the party which understood the issues of women's position in society as a sex class, which had passed that legislation and created those posts. It was our party, and several of us had only joined because we were so sure of Labour's understanding of these issues. It was a bitter disappointment to discover that Labour, in common with all the other political parties, was willing to replace understanding of the objective and material definition of sex with the non-observable inner feeling of something called gender identity. Hence, the first statement of the declaration is that basic understanding that formed the basis of the women's liberation movement and all that has developed from it over the last 50 years. 1. Women and girls are subject to discrimination and oppression on the basis of their sex. Over the previous few years, and particularly since the intention had been announced to change the Gender Recognition Act, women had met to discuss the ramifications of the ideas of gender identity and the importance and validity of women's sex-based rights. Almost without exception, these meetings have been disrupted and attendees harassed, culminating in the truly shocking events at a meeting called by Women's Place UK during the Labour Party conference of 2019, shortly before our meeting at Filia. Women and men arriving at the meeting were abused in various ways, and speakers had to raise their voices throughout the meeting, while the protesters banged on the windows and shouted. Shockingly, this behaviour was endorsed by 2 speakers on the conference floor the next day. Thus, our second and third statements are: 2. Women have the right to freedom of belief, freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, which comes from Articles 18, 19 and 20 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And 3, women have the right to discuss policies which affect them without being abused, harassed or intimidated. The Equality Act was designed to protect 9 characteristics, of which 1 is sex. As I have already outlined, the importance of single-sex provision for traumatised women is key to provision of refuges, homelessness, hostels, rape crisis centres and much more. And the Equality Act permits generic and service-wide exceptions to the general assumption of non-discrimination on the basis of sex, where this is a proportionate means to a legitimate aim. It's also clear that in contexts where women are vulnerable, such as those that involve the removal of clothing, an assumption of single-sex provision would be legitimate. Hence, our 4th declaration point. Women have the right to maintain their sex-based protections as set out in the Equality Act 2010. These include female-only spaces such as changing rooms, hospital wards, sanitary and sleeping accommodation, refuges, hostels, and prisons. There has been considerable concern about participation in sport. Transgender people understandably wish to continue to participate in sport after transition, but there is a mass of evidence to establish that anyone who is born male, and most particularly anyone who has gone through a male puberty, is provided with a major advantage in many aspects of sport. Lungs have greater capacity, limbs are proportionally longer, muscle mass is much greater, and so on. Hence, to permit those who self-ID as female to compete against women guarantees that the women against whom they compete will be at a disadvantage. In contact sports such as boxing or rugby, there are serious physical dangers to women competing against those who have grown up as men. You may have seen recently that World Rugby considered all the detailed scientific evidence and decided that only women should play elite women's rugby, although it seems that the UK bodies, and certainly the one for England, will not follow suit despite the considerable evidence. Additionally, in team sports and in selection for competition, the inclusion of trans women will mean that a girl or woman will not get the place for which they have trained. Thus, our 5th point states, women have the right to participate in single-sex sports to ensure fairness and safety at all levels of competition. Just as groups of disabled people, people of colour and others, including trans groups, have a right to undertake activities together because of their shared experiences, so we believe should women. Hence our point 6. Women have the right to organise themselves as a sex across a range of cultural, leisure, educational and political activities. Our shock and distress at what has happened at branch, CLP and national level when women have tried to self-organise impelled us to be quite specific about the need for the Labour Party and the trades union movement to step up. So, point 7, we condemn all attempts to undermine or limit the rights of women to self-organise and call on the Labour Party and the trades union movement to actively support these essential freedoms. When we assert these 7 statements, we are frequently accused of something termed transphobia and of being trans-exclusionary radical feminists, which gives rise to the abusive term TERF. It needs to be absolutely clear that we do not hate or fear transgender people, nor do we wish to exclude them from society. We wish, in the materialist tradition of the Labour Party, to recognise the reasons behind the various laws and customs that have ensured the dignity and safety of women and girls. Women are a sex class. We can no more identify out of the facts of female existence than we can identify out of the oppression manifested in a class-based society. We entirely agree that trans people should be free from harassment and discrimination, and the Equality Act 2010 explicitly covers conduct that is related to a protected characteristic and violates dignity or creates an intimidating, hostile, or humiliating situation. The changes to the definition and understanding of the word woman in the Labour Party took place without consultation with women and with no assessment of the impact on us or the party as a whole. It is both natural justice and stated Labour policy that women should be considered and consulted in all aspects of policy. Our primary purpose is to hold the Labour Party to its previously clear commitment to countering the disadvantage, discrimination and oppression faced by women, which in part involves, as stated clearly in the 2019 manifesto, ensuring that the single sex-based exemptions contained in the Equality Act 2010 are understood and fully enforced in service provision. However, although our focus is the Labour Party, all that we are doing relates to the work of many women's groups within political parties and in many other contexts. These issues pervade society and are in no way specific to Labour. We hope that you will support our aims in whatever way you are able to do so.
Thank you very much, Alice, for that excellent talk. If anybody would like to have the transcript of that, everything, the video, it will all be on our website. So to have a deeper read and concentrate a bit more on what Alice had to say, that'll be something you can do. Before our next speaker, I'd like to show you some of the key achievements that Labour Women's Declaration have had in this 1 year of our existence. Our petition at the moment stands at 5,600 signatories, and that includes the 300 founder signatories. We held a national meeting in London in February, and I know from seeing the attendance list that some of you were at that, as were many of you at our Expel Me rally on the 9th of March, prior to lockdown, of course, but it feels like a long time ago now. The Twitter handles for Women Uniting UK, I mentioned about the cross-party work, and also the link for lesbians at Lesbian Labour. We've also been fortunate, eventually we were all beginning to lose hope, but we have open communications now with all the key Labour figures who we need to be speaking to. And the sterling piece of work that Bronwyn did was to contact all the NEC candidates and ask them what their standpoint was and their view on women's sex-based rights. And we have actually published our list of recommended NEC candidates. If you haven't found that, please do find your way to our website and other links in order to vote, especially Esther Giles, who I see is with us. I've noticed her in the chat, and she's having a particularly hard time, so anything you can do to get Esther for treasurer, go ahead. The other thing is, obviously you've all been very busy, not necessarily the women's working group, but the number of free speech motions that you've managed to get through at CLP and the gender critical motions. You're out there doing the work on the floor. So that's just some of our things after a year. I'm going to hand on to Helena now, who's going to fill out the picture of our first year a bit more. So over to Helena.
Hello there. So actually, as Alice said briefly there, it's our birthday today. Yeah, born out of the efforts of the great women, past and present. Back in September 2019, Women's Place UK were aggressively protested against and condemned on stage at the Labour Party conference. It also, that month, saw the death of the magnificent Magdalene Burns. So enough of us were catching up now, and enough of us had found each other and could see the necessity of making ourselves visible within the Labour Party. We pushed together with the Labour Party to make assurances on sex-based rights in the UK and Scottish manifestos. We pushed to open up channels of communication with Labour MPs and peers. 0ctober has asked the government what statutory guidance it intends to give public bodies in keeping with legislation. So that's the start. And yesterday, Lord Hunt asked the same again in the House of Lords, after raising questions along with Labour Lord Young and Treesman last month. So that has moved on from no debate. Outside of Labour, there's been cross-party work, including some organised through Women Uniting, whose own petition is currently standing at 7,632 signatures. There's been Kira Bell's court case against the Tabby, the first of several court cases now stacked up and ready to go, like Authentic Equity Alliance's challenge to the EHRC, and for Women Scotland's case against the Scottish Government. We've celebrated revised government guidance not to teach children that they can be born in the wrong body. And World Rugby's decision to stipulate all female participation in female sport. And we hope that England Rugby can eventually catch up to that. Since Liz Truss's announcement, there's been a poor response from Labour. Hounding of Rosie Duffield going ignored and in some cases actively encouraged. We've been disinvited to attend CLP talks and smeared as anti-trans by our own party's members and officers for speaking up for our sex. In Scotland, GRA reform is not off the agenda. The guidance to the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act, which redefines woman, and the Hate Crime Scotland Bill could criminalise anyone speaking out on women's sex-based rights. And in England, Stella Creasy's teamed up with Stonewall in her campaign to make misogyny a hate crime, and Stonewall representatives have spoken of consolidation and rationalisation of hate crime protections. So that does look like Stonewall are going for redefinition by conflation of sex and gender or gender identity in criminal law in England and Wales as well. Nearly every UK institution's already adopted self-ID, and many are replacing the collection of data on sex with the indefinable concept of gender identity. So we have our work cut out. And part of that work is to carry on trying to engage the left in what our fundamental arguments really are amid the smearing and false accusations that are used against us. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Helena. I should be visible, but never mind. I can just introduce Shireen next, our second speaker tonight, who is a member and former branch officer of the University and College Union, the University of Edinburgh branch. As well as being in the LWD working group, Shireen is part of For Women Scotland. Her talk is entitled A Materialist Feminist Perspective on Women's Rights. Thank you, Shireen.
Thanks very much, Paula. So I'm going to look in a bit more detail at the thinking behind our declaration. And I want to start with our first point, which is women and girls are subject to discrimination and oppression on the basis of their sex. And this proposition is the cornerstone of the declaration. It's the basis for everything that follows, and it delineates our distinct position as socialists as well as feminists. So we need to be able to explain it and defend it and understand where it comes from. I've lost my second slide, never mind. Before I get to that, I want to be very clear that what's often referred to in the press as the row about trans rights is nothing of the sort. It's a row about women's rights, about who should hold them and on what basis, and we need to keep saying that. It's a row over how we answer the question, should women's rights pertain to biological sex and be held by those who are born female? Or should women's rights be held by anyone who believes themselves to be a woman or asserts that they're a woman? Now, our answer to that question is unequivocal, and it stems from our conceptual background in materialist feminism, as well as our activism in the labour and trade union movement. Much as I'd love to, I don't have time for a detailed discussion of all the many nuances and shades of materialist feminism. I'd love to do it, but there really isn't time. So I'm just going to address 3 points. What do we mean when we say women are oppressed on the basis of sex? Second, how do we understand gender as materialist feminists? And third, how do we understand the current attack on women's rights? Sorry, just getting a message there. On women's rights in the context of present-day neoliberal and corporate capitalism.
Shireen, I'm messaging you about your slides. Can you make it full screen for the slide?
I thought I had.
Yeah, sorry, thanks.
Is that better?
That's
okay.
Perfect.
Right. Sorry about that. I thought I'd done it. So let's start with oppression and a fairly standard Marxist class analysis, which has been the jumping off point for the development of materialist feminism. Oppression is the most important means of maintaining relations of subordination and domination between the classes. And in capitalist societies, that means maintaining the institutionalized imbalance of wealth and power between those who sell their labor for less than its material value on the one hand, and those who extract labor and other resources for profit on the other. So seen that way, oppression is both a function of class society and a product of it, which is to say a class society requires structures, institutions and laws that enable the subordination of those who sell their labor by those who exploit it and profit from it. And a class society also produces dominant narratives and ways of understanding the world that make such subordination seem normal, natural, and taken for granted. And I'll come back to that point in a bit. So materialist feminists have argued variously that women are a sex class or they're a distinct oppressed group. And I don't have time to address that divergence of views today, but where there's agreement is that women's reproductive capacity has been systematically exploited, extracted, and appropriated. Women's distinct oppression, the oppression we experience as women, stems from the fact that as a class or a distinct group, if you'd rather, we belong to the half of the population that has the capacity to reproduce, irrespective of whether any individual woman actually bears children. It's our biological sex, determined at conception and traditionally observed and recorded at birth, though of course these days that often happens in utero, that determines whether we're members of the group that performs reproductive labour for less than the cost of that labour, known as women, or the group that materially benefits from the provision of reproductive labour for less than its cost, known as men. Sexism, the systematic oppression of women, is socially constructed, but it's the consequence of biological sex in a class society. And there's evidence everywhere, in workplaces, in pay packets, in the home, in politics, and so on, that sexism is still all too real. A moment ago, I said that a class society needs and produces structures, institutions, and laws that enable the oppression of one class by another. When it comes to women's oppression, many of us in this webinar today, I know, have been involved in the struggle to make changes to those things, campaigning for instance, for equal pay, for women's reproductive rights, for better political representation, for statutory single-sex spaces, and many, many other things. I also said that a class society produces narratives that naturalize oppression, making it seem unremarkable and inevitable. Now, it's important to understand that oppression is always a process, and it's a dynamic relationship that adapts to changes in any given society's structures, institutions, and laws. It needs to be constantly reworked and relegitimated. The collection of narratives that shapes how a society understands and constructs the relationship between women and men, which delineates acceptable and desirable ways of being male and female, and which maintains male privilege, is gender. Seen that way, we can call gender an ideology, in that it's a set of narratives and expectations constructed in and by a political context in which men as a group oppress women as a group on the basis of biological sex. and it's a means by which that ongoing oppression is legitimated, normalised, and made to seem inevitable. And like any ideology, it changes over time to adapt to changing contexts, and it intersects with other indices of structural inequality, including race and disability. But its function remains the same: to enable the reproduction of oppressive structures and to divide the oppressed. So that's gender. Gender identity, on the other hand, is the much newer idea that every individual has an inner sense of maleness, femaleness, or something else. And I agree that as individuals, we do develop a gendered sense of ourselves as a result of being embedded in pervasive narratives about masculinity and femininity from the moment we're born. But although those narratives may appear to be enduring, for instance, the association of boys and men with aggression and violence, and the association of girls and women with passivity and kindness, and although they're certainly powerful narratives with all sorts of effects, they're not natural or inevitable, but rather they're both the function and the product of sex-based oppression. And if the narratives themselves are socially located and socially produced, then it doesn't make sense to regard an individual's gendered sense of self as in any way innate or hardwired or biologically inevitable. The end goal for materialist feminists isn't to reify gender through the belief in an innate gender identity, or to accept that gender should impose limitations on how women and men can live our lives, or to create additional gender categories in the mistaken belief that creating new gender boxes will liberate anybody. Instead, the end goal is the abolition of gender and the oppressive structures and narratives it needs and produces. And in the meantime, while we work towards that abolition, our job as materialist feminists is to continue to challenge the limitations that gendered structures and expectations impose on people, to demonstrate how gender is deployed to oppress women and girls, and to support those who live gender non-conforming lives. Now, class societies have of course moved on since Marx first analysed their dynamics, and so too have theories for understanding and organising against oppression, led by feminists, anti-racists, disabled activists, lesbian and gay activists, and so on, all developing conceptual and practical tools for progressive change. But what we can't afford to lose sight of, and I'd argue we need it now more than ever for many reasons, is a class analysis. I'll just give a couple of examples of that. So in our neoliberal times, for instance, citizens have largely been redefined as individual consumers whose democratic rights and choices are best exercised by buying and selling. And we see that individualization reflected in the present crisis of women's rights. The view that gender identity should supersede biological sex as a way of determining who should access women's rights is antithetical to a class analysis because it's based on the belief that individuals can opt into or out of sex-based oppression, which is an impossibility. Oppression just doesn't work like that because it's located in the social and political structures through which people exist and experience the world. We also need to pay attention to the corporate sleight of hand through which the struggle for equality has been redefined as EDI, which stands for Equality, Diversity, Inclusion, and reduced to a bureaucratic compliance agenda that allows corporations to virtue signal whilst maximising their profits from the extraction of labour. A materialist feminist analysis helps us understand what's happening, for example, when corporations fall over themselves to sign up to Stonewall's Diversity Champion scheme. It's a cheap way of scoring EDI points. It's very easy to fly a rainbow flag and distribute pronoun badges, while actual employment practices deteriorate in the pursuit of profit, with more and more workers on precarious and low-paid contracts, especially in the sectors where women are employed, and even more especially in those where Black women are employed and young women are employed. So class analysis helps us understand what's going on in that dynamic. And it also helps us understand how corporate interests have been complicit in privatising and, let's be honest, almost obliterating public discussion of women's rights. To finish, a few weeks ago, someone asked me what could possibly be lost if women's rights were accessed on the basis of gender identity instead of sex, and why we couldn't just be kind and inclusive. Well, here's 3 things that, for starters, that matter to us as women on the political left. First, the disappearance of single-sex spaces and facilities is experienced most intensely by those girls and women who are disproportionately affected by the class system. Those living in poverty, Black and ethnic minority women, older and disabled women, and those in prisons and refuges. So to take just one example, it sounds like quite a trivial one, but I think it's important. The Youth Hostels Association changing its policy to segregate dormitories according to gender identity instead of sex potentially affects all women, but has a much greater impact on women living in poverty who can't afford more expensive accommodation than it does on women who can pay for alternatives. Second, the inability to name sex-based oppression removes our ability to identify and change the structures, institutions and laws that oppress women, and removes our capacity to measure progress towards the eradication of sexism. It also removes our ability to organise as women, as a sex class or distinct group, against our oppression, developing theories and actions out of our lived experience, and often embodied experience, as women. And incidentally, some of this was discussed in length on Sunday's fantastic Women's Place UK seminar on sex and the census. And if you missed it, you can catch up on their WP UK YouTube channel, and I do recommend that. So third, reconfiguring the rights of any oppressed group, not only without public discussion, but in a climate of intimidation and silencing of members of that group, sets a really dangerous precedent. And that's something that everyone in the Labour Party and trade union movement should be deeply concerned about. So to sum up, materialist feminism helps us understand, I think, that women and girls are still oppressed on the basis of sex, meaning that we continue to require the sex-based rights and provisions that mitigate against our oppression and enable us to fight for the equal society we all want to bring into being. And it's not bigoted or hateful to say so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shireen. That's another excellent talk, which I'm sure we'll all want to access as we move forward. This is now the moment that we move on to what our 10 priorities will be moving forward. So we'd just like to go through those. We want to, in this coming year, end the Labour Party and trade union silencing of women. So that's our key aim. Anything you can do to help us with these priorities, please do. Raise the profile of our campaigns. Obviously, the regional Labour Women's Declaration networks need to be developed, and it seems to be that at local level, when you're able to know what the position is in your geographical area, that the work really begins to take off. I'm very keen to move forward with the At Lesbian Labour. Trade unions, we already just asked for your support on that. We'll continue to lobby politicians, and obviously that's something everybody can do. We'll be moving forward with our cross-party collaboration. And just to say a note here to anybody who isn't Labour that's with us, sisters in the other parties are having exactly the same problem. Even our Tory sisters, with the exception of the Communist Party. So there you go, they're also on board. I think they understand the sex-based, the class-based basis for women's oppression. So we're going to continue collaborating with other women's campaigns. Everybody needs to challenge policy capture, and quickly, because this stealth thing is, you know, conflating sex and gender is getting in through the side door, the back door, and every other open doorway. And most importantly, even though it's number 10, let's do something about the hate crime proposals. So that was our priorities. There's an opportunity for us to help you out at constituency level. I'm going to hand over to Tracy, who's going to talk a little bit about that.
Yes. I think one of the previous speakers alluded to the fact that we have been cancelled by other CLP meetings and one cancellation happened at a constituency not very far from where I am right now. It was cancelled following a complaint by somebody who didn't know who we were, but claimed that we would create a hostile atmosphere for trans members. We were accused of being a transphobic, right-wing, misogynist and homophobic group, which we find rather surprising as half of us are lesbians. And we were never given the chance to refute any of these claims. Sadly, two female members of the executive committee of this particular CLP have resigned from their officer positions over this and related issues in that CLP. And we know this isn't an isolated incident. In fact, we know that many of you that are here now have experienced similar and even worse, including campaigns leading to your prevention from standing as candidates or smearing when you are standing for election, sustained personal social media attacks, hacking, threats of violence, no platforming, malicious and badly handled complaints, refusal or suspension of membership, even expulsion, as well as being shouted down in real and online meetings and forums and called transphobes and TERFs. We are collecting evidence about all of this to present to the party in early November. So please contact us if you haven't already to give us evidence that we can share. Now, we believe that the only way to really win hearts and minds is to talk in proper dialogue. I mean, social media is fine, but it doesn't quite cut it as a medium for real dialogue. And the sort of discourse we think when Keir Starmer says more light, less heat, we're hoping that today's event actually becomes a marker for engagement of the Labour Women's Declaration with local groups, and that you will encourage your CLPs to invite us to talk to them about the campaign. We also hope that the embryonic local networks will bolster members in branches to propose free speech and sex-based rights motions, of which we have exemplars passed in some of the London CLPs, for example, which we can share with you. And if you do want us to talk at one of your meetings, or if you want us to help you to prepare your own presentation and provide you with support and backup, then please contact us. We're here to help, we're here to support. That's what this campaign is all about. So thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. The other thing that we need to do to grow the movement is to develop our regional networks. As you noticed at the beginning, most of the country is geographically covered, but obviously UK Labour includes different countries as well. So I'd like us to end by being inspired by the fabulous work that our Welsh sisters are doing. And I'm going to hand over to Bronwyn, who will tell us about the wonderful work that they're doing in Wales.
Thank you, Paula. Labour Women's Declaration Cymru has about 60 gender critical women members of Welsh Labour in it, from 17 of the 40 CLPs in Wales. So we actually still have some way to go in improving our reach. We came together 3 years ago, almost exactly, when 8 of us met in Cardiff to discuss the opposition from trans rights activists to women meeting to discuss concerns about proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act. So this was at about the time, just after the attack on Maria McLachlan at Speaker's Corner in London. Those of us who were on Facebook were added to a secret group for gender critical women in the Labour Party, and we went on to set up a secret Facebook group for all gender critical women in Wales. So the group LWD Cymru has its roots very much in the wider women's movement. We're not separate from it. We've been involved in action with women outside the Labour Party, for instance, in the Fair Play for Women campaign in 2018. And then again in the T-shirts action, which was organised by Resisters in January 2019, when 4 separate groups in South Wales dressed statues in T-shirts which said, "Woman equals adult human female." And we got some great media coverage. We've also asked questions and leafleted at Labour Party conference and at Welsh Labour conference. We were due to hold a fringe meeting at Welsh Labour conference this year, cancelled sadly because of the lockdown. As Paula has already said, it's been a question of gathering support one conversation at a time. We started collecting supporters' email addresses so as not to exclude women who did not use social media. So in fact, this year, it has been easy for us to move to having Zoom meetings, which we started doing in May and which we've continued monthly. We're currently focusing on trying to influence the manifesto for the Senedd elections in Wales next year. Women in Scotland, London, the North and other regions are supporting each other in similar ways to us. Your journey won't be the same, but knowing that you have the support of other women in your locality and your region of the Labour Party is priceless. Go for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Now, just before we finish, Kerry, anything urgent that's happened during the session?
Well, if we're going to actually finish on time, we've got 4 minutes, and I don't think there's a little bit of stuff you need to do before the end. I suppose the only thing I'd want to reiterate, that there's so many great questions that we've got. This is our first. It's a webinar. We'll be doing meetings in the future. Contact us if you've got ideas and requests and offers. But most of all, to back up what Bron just said about organising in Wales. We're having a London Zoom in November. There'll be about 80 or 100 at that meeting. We are many. It's just that because of the intimidation, it's been very hard to link up with each other. But now you have a way of doing that. Contact us if you want to be put in touch with somebody locally, because we've got a question here from somebody in South London saying, how can we talk about this when everyone's shouting at us and calling us transphobic in our CLP? The first thing you need to do is make sure you're not alone and rally local support. And if you don't know anybody, we'll put you in touch with them. That's it.
Okay, thanks very much, Kerry. Now, I just want to say we will post the video and any other follow-up on the website and on YouTube. So our final request to you is, if you haven't already done so, please do sign the declaration and encourage others to do so. And we want your ideas and suggestions. I hope that you have all done what I said at the beginning. You've met someone, you've learned something, and you've been inspired. And thank you all for taking part. And on a final note, I'd like to say, as a musician and an artist, we in Labour Women's Declaration are keen supporters of the arts, absolutely, and a lot of us are involved in the arts. So we're going to play you out with our song and video. It's our birthday thing, but we believe in using the arts and different formats to spread our message. So if there are other musicians, singers, artists, poets, other creatives who want to be involved, please get in touch, either with me or Helena, but just generally make contact. So here we go. No more silencing of women. Thank you.
We know that girls and women are oppressed because of sex, and female-only spaces must be guaranteed and kept. We want the right to safety and to fairness in our sports, and the cause goes marching on. Labour Women's Declaration, Labour Women's Declaration, Labour Women's Declaration, we're fighting for our rights. The right to meet, the right to speak, the right to state our views, the right to hold opinions which are not the same as you, the right to not be cancelled when we simply speak our truth, and the cause goes marching on. Labour Women's Declaration, Labour Women's Declaration, Labour Women's Declaration, we're fighting for our rights. Educational, political and leisure and the arts may need women-only spaces if we're going to make a start in organising women as a sex to change the world, and the cause goes marching on. Labour Women's Declaration, Labour Women's Declaration, Labour Women's Declaration, we're fighting for our rights. When we organise together, we should do so free from harm, and our brothers in the unions must start sounding the alarm. When abuse, intimidation or harassment is on show, it's time to shout out no. No more silencing of women. No more silencing of women. No more silencing of women. Our voices will be heard. No more silencing of women. No more silencing of women. No more silencing of women. Our voices will be heard.